Hello. So my name is Ameya Okamoto. I'm an artist and organizer currently based in New York City and Boston usually, but currently physically in Portland, Oregon, which is my hometown and the city I grew up in, which I'm sure many of you all on this TEDx call relate to being quarantined with your families or social distancing to the best of your abilities. So at this point, months have passed and we've all begun to learn the different ways in which we interact with ourselves and with each other while quarantined. We all impact each other's senses of identity and purpose, right? That's like the beauty of being at school or being in college, is that we get to interact with different types of people and people from different backgrounds and cultures and identities, and it informs our own sense of self. And we don't get to do that when we are stuck at home and a little bit on lockdown. So it's now more than ever that we're beginning to be aware of our differences because we don't have access to talking to other people. The pandemic is also happening at a global time of civil and political unrest. And especially in America, it's happening during a time of an outcry call for accountability from the government against police violence and a racial reckoning where many people are being forced to critically reflect on their own identities and think maybe for the first time critical questions like, where am I most valuable? Who am I and what are my privileges, and how can I make an impact? So I'm back in Portland, which also happens to be the whitest major city in America. And it was here in Portland, which, don't get me wrong, I love my hometown, where I had many of my first, you know, formative experiences as a kid. This is where I had my first kiss. This is where I went to my first school dance. It's where I drove my first car. But it's also where, you know, I was taught and I was got desensitized to comments that were not uncommon for me, like, you're cute for an Asian girl, or why aren't you better at math, or you're basically white, uh, to affirm my sense of belonging as sometimes the only non-white person, individual in a friend group or a classroom, or sometimes even in a, on a street or a community. So this is also the city where I learned to skip school, or skip art classes even, because I was annoyed by my art teachers commenting and calling my art too oriental, or too political. So it was here in Portland where I learned to be embarrassed of my Asianness and embarrassed of my difference. But it was also here in Portland, or leaving Portland, where I learned uh, to embrace who I am, and breaking out of that sense of invisibility and breaking out of that feeling of silencing that happened here, was the most empowering experience of my life. So we're going to be talking about race, intersectionality, and art. And I have tried to record this talk so many times, so it's a little casual. But I'm gonna attempt to kind of facilitate a short slam poetry-esque activity together. So bear with me. None of y'all can probably see each other in the video, so please do it with me if you feel comfortable. A good friend of mine who is a poet helped me develop an exercise that kind of helps me reflect on my own identity, and how I feel about who I am, in all the different parts of myself. And so it's called How Do You Hold? So we're going to do this together. So wherever you are, I want you to take a deep breath and relax and put your feet on the ground, and feel the earth beneath you and stay rooted. And I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I want you to respond with your body, right? So the first question is, how do you hold a pencil? How do you hold your phone when you take a selfie? How do you hold a child? How do you hold a basketball? Now, how do you hold your race? Is it something that you hold comfortably? Is it something you're embarrassed about? Is your race something that holds you down? Is it something that you hold in different parts? How do you hold your gender? Does it slip through your fingers? Do you keep trying to put it back together? How do you hold your sexuality? You know, is it something that you keep in your back pocket? Um, is it something that you hold behind you, like you're embarrassed? Is it something that you hold proudly? So these are just a few identities. There are countless identities that make up who we are, but already the ways that they interact with each other and the ways that they complement or the complement or kind of fight each other, it already gets really complicated, right? And so the last question is, how do we hold all of our identities together, right? Do they fit into a neat box that we can throw in our backpacks and we just hold our identities together and who we are, right? Are we confident in who we are? Do our identities fall out of that box and we're constantly trying to put them back in and figure it out? You know, do we hold our identities in our hands and is it complicated and it's slipping through our fingers, you know? And it will change the way that we hold ourselves and the way that we hold our identities changes over time as we figure out who we are, we get more comfortable with our identities and we get more comfortable with our box and taking things out and putting different identities in and trying out what feels most comfortable. So hopefully that kind of made sense, because if it didn't, that's okay, because identity is effing complicated, and we don't often visually think about how we hold the different parts of ourselves together. And figuring out how these different parts of ourselves intersect and interact with each other is a lifelong, endless learning process. So, just kind of my attempt at starting to unpack and think more critically about who we are and how we want to present who we are. Everything we do, create, and say comes from our identities, and it impacts our relationships, how we live in this world, our personal expression, and especially for me as an artist, it impacts the art that I create and the art that I share with the world. How you hold your identities, how you stand in intersectionalities, and how you interact with other people is at the core of starting to understand your role in social progress and in social justice. So, to talk about and reflect on our identities and begin to understand that, we must understand what our identities are. For me and for America and our entire world right now, race is the most important identity. But for me, it wasn't always like this. As a child, I'm originally from New York City, where I grew up really bold and privileged and colorful. As a kid, my mom let me do whatever I wanted, cut my own bangs, wear whatever the heck I wanted. And I grew up surrounded by people from different cultures and backgrounds, and I heard 10 different languages every single day walking down the street, and I was surrounded by different types of art growing up in Manhattan, when it was still a place of artists and teachers and young people young people figuring out who they are and who they want to be. And so, growing up in New York City as a young person, I was thriving, but I was also very protected. I'm the middle child of three sisters, and I grew up in a family where I was allowed to be kind of like bold, outrageous, and outspoken. And at school, where, New York City is one of the most diverse places in the world, probably, I was celebrated for my differences. And, my classmates and my peers were celebrated for their own unique cultures and their different skin colors. And I swear I had a holiday every other weekend or every other week, because New York City public schools like took a vacation on like every holiday, which is very uncommon in other cities. So even though I know now that race dictates all interactions, at the time or as a child, I was not acutely aware of race and racisms. The topic about race And, being Asian when I was like 6, 7 years old wasn't an off limits conversation. But in New York, where race is a lot more of a okay topic to talk about because there are so many different races, um, being Asian and being other and being different was something to be celebrated. And this was not the culture that I had my entire life. So, this childhood of color and exploration and art came to a sudden and frankly very violent stop in 2007, where, in an attempt to escape a dangerous and unhealthy situation at home, my mom, who remains the strongest woman I know and who has broken more glass ceilings than I can count, moved my two sisters and I literally across the country, like opposite coasts, to start a new life from New York City, the mecca for diversity, and Portland, Oregon, the widest major city in America. Um, yeah, which Portland, Oregon remains the widest major city in America. And it was here in Portland as a young child where I experienced the most blatant racism and exclusion, and where my mother did her best to navigate sudden poverty from family stuff and protect her daughters. It was not until moving to Portland had I ever experienced being the only non-white person in a classroom, or the feelings that came along with hiding my differences and hiding the hardships and struggles that I was having in my personal life, in my family, and at home. Um, and I felt as if growing up here that Portland, or maybe the world, was doing everything possible to make me feel like I didn't belong. And for me, as I struggled to understand and reconcile these differences, I also began to learn the ways that these differences gave me insight and sensitivity to injustice, right? Like being different. And when you're surrounded by people who don't look like you and don't act like you begin to notice those differences even more intensely, and you begin to think differently too. Someone recently asked me, what fuels you? And through all my positivity and color and openness, I can confidently say that my fueling factor is rage. When you grow up constantly battling personal and public demons, you really get knocked down and kicked down. But these battles and life experiences that I've had to counteract and push through also has gifted me with a constant supply of rage and passion to correct what is right and what is just, um, and correct what is unjust. And my upbringing of traveling back and forth between two coasts, from the diversity of New York to the white utopia that is Portland, prepared me in an odd way with the insight and passion for social justice that I have now, and that fuels my creative practice. Throughout my upbringing, I began to develop an acute, I'm reading a little bit, I began to develop a lens of race and acute sensitivity to injustice. And this lens of injustice and this lens of race, which I see everything with, is what is the lens that I approach each one of my identities with. And it's the lens that I approach each one of my intersectionalities and every interaction that I have with, is through the lens of race and justice and what is right. As a person, but especially as a woman of color, I relate to the intense feelings of difference and oppression that happen, especially when you're surrounded by people who you do not relate to. The feeling of being not enough for myself, but also the feelings of not being enough for the world. Um, it caused me for years to struggle. Um, it caused me to kind of struggle when you feel so knocked down and small, and you want to help the world. You really struggle with understanding how you can even interact with and support upheaval and injustice at kind of a national scale. Um, how do I as an individual, these are the questions I would ask myself, is like, how do I as an individual respond to increasing visibility um, this world of police brutality, gun violence, attacks on women's rights, tightening borders, overall invisibility. These are kind of just a few of the, I think, I would say problems that our generation, Gen Z, is really fighting and confronting. Um, yeah, but when we as individuals begin to understand who we are and our privileges and how we hold our privileges, we also begin to understand where we are most valuable and the roles in social justice that we can fill. So as an artist, it is my duty to witness and record the times that we're living in. My early childhood experiences set the foundation for my understanding of who I am and how I interact with the world, my peers, and my art. The first piece that I ever created in support of the movement for Black Lives was in 2015, and it was a portrait of Michael Brown Jr., who was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And this piece and a series later became banners and posters, and it was marched through the streets of my hometown, the widest major city in America. My last year of high school, in 2018, the Parkland high school shooting in Florida sparked national student outrage. And I created art in response to gun violence as a way to cope with increasing anxieties and fears of our generation and connect with other young people across the country. Last year, the celebration of the 50 years since the Stonewall riots in New York City, which was the first gay pride parade in the fight for gay liberation, I created a series with Planned Parenthood to honor the work of Stormy DeLarvery, Sylvia Rivera, and Marsha P. Johnson. And as a young queer person myself, the opportunity to memorialize and honor these queer icons that make my own open existence possible was the greatest honor. As an Asian American person in social justice, in general, I've struggled to find my place. And so, to quote the historian Jeff Chang, whose book We Gon' Be Alright has basically become my personal Bible, Asians he categorizes as the quote unquote in betweeners. You know, we're in between black and white, in between complicity and freedom, in between narrow self interest and equal justice, right? Asians kind of exist on this line, and we have, in many instances, the privilege of the decision to choose which side of history we're on. And now is not the time to be complicit right now in America, but everywhere. Now is the time to step up and choose what side of history we're on. Because racial justice impacts us all, and now is not the time to be neutral, not only for Asian Americans, but for everyone. We all have the opportunities in our lives to choose which side of history we're on. Who we are and where we come from fuels the way that we approach and interact with others. When we work to understand our differences, we're able to recognize them and effectively work together to take down the unjust systems that define our world. There is a place for everyone in justice work, whether that's being an artist, an organizer, a medic, a supporter, a friend, or even on the front lines of protest. What is really important to understand is that there's no perfect or right way to interact with activism, because it's not like there's a blueprint or definition of like how a young person can change the world. And no matter what we do, we have to remember that this fight right now is not going to end with our generation or even the next or even the next, right? This is hundreds of years of battling historical oppression and injustice. But now is not the time. Now is the time to step up and think critically about how we hold our identities and about how we share and present them with others. And we have to be open to shifting the ways that we carry all of our identities together, and share them with other people. Each of us, I'm talking to all of you, each of us have our own experiences with oppressions and sufferings, whether that's with our older siblings, horrible bosses, or bullies on the playground. But the big question to take away is, how are you going to use your experiences with those oppressions? How are you going to use your story and your experiences to help and fight for others. So with that, thank you.